I visited my wife's CEO office unannounced, and the sign at the entrance left me speechless because it didn't just stop me, it erased me. The moment I said I was her husband, the guard laughed like I had told a joke that didn't belong in that building. Then he looked at his screen and said, "Sir, her husband just left 5 minutes ago." I remember how the air inside that glass lobby suddenly felt colder, like the building itself had decided I didn't belong there. I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, something simple I could fix with one phone call. But when I looked through the glass doors and saw the man walking out beside her, everything I believed about my marriage stopped making sense. And in that moment, I didn't feel angry first. I felt replaced. If this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever felt unseen in a place you were supposed to belong, please take a second to like and subscribe, not for me, but for stories like this that deserve to be heard. And if you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city or country, and what time it is there right now, because somehow knowing someone is listening makes this easier to tell. My name is Jonathan Carter. I'm 46 years old. And what happened that day at Hale Dynamics in downtown Chicago didn't just change my marriage, it changed the way I understood truth itself, and I still don't think I've fully processed it. It started like any other morning that had slowly become unfamiliar over the years. Quiet coffee in a kitchen that used to feel like home, a phone that no longer lit up with messages from the woman I married, and a calendar where her name appeared less and less except for business events I was never invited to. Victoria Hale was my wife, and she was also the CEO of Hale Dynamics, one of those rising Chicago firms in the West Loop where glass towers reflect ambition more than sunlight, and somewhere along the way I stopped knowing where her work ended and where we began. That morning, I didn't call ahead. I didn't schedule anything. I just drove through downtown Chicago traffic with a strange weight in my chest. I couldn't name, passing the river, the steel bridges, and the mirrored buildings that all looked too clean to hold anything messy like doubt. I told myself I was just visiting, just confirming something I didn't want to believe, because sometimes silence in a marriage feels like distance, but sometimes it feels like construction. Hale Dynamics headquarters rose in front of me like a statement, all glass and authority, and I remember standing across the street for a moment just watching people enter like they knew exactly who they were in that place. Inside the lobby, the lighting was too perfect, the kind of white glow that makes everyone look slightly guilty even when they've done nothing wrong, and I walked up to the security desk where a man in a Navy suit badge stood watching me like he had already decided I didn't belong. His name tag read Mike Reynolds, and he didn't even try to hide the fact that he was assessing me before I spoke. I told him calmly, "I'm here to see Victoria Hale." He glanced at the system, typed once, then again, then leaned back slightly and gave a short laugh like I had misunderstood the entire structure of the building. "Sir," he said, tapping the screen, "there is no record of you on the executive family list." I remember blinking slowly because that sentence didn't make sense in my world. Not after 17 years of marriage, not after shared homes, shared losses, shared mornings where nothing required verification. I repeated myself, a little slower this time, "I'm her husband." That was when he looked up at me, not surprised, not confused, but almost amused, and said the words that I still hear when everything goes quiet. "Sir, her husband already checked in today." For a second I thought I misheard him, like the brain sometimes refuses to process nonsense when it arrives too suddenly, but then I saw his hand gesture toward the glass security doors behind him, and instinct made me turn before I even understood why. Through the glass, I saw the elevator open on the executive floor, and a man stepped out with the ease of someone who belonged there, someone recognized, someone expected, and beside him was Victoria. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not the polite professional smile she used in photos, but something lighter, something real, something that used to be reserved for me. The guard was still speaking, something about protocol and access verification, but his voice faded into background noise as my attention locked on the movement inside that building. On the way, Victoria slightly leaned toward the man as they spoke, like distance was not something she needed to maintain. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel in that moment, because anger comes with clarity, and confusion comes with questions. But what I felt instead was a strange silence inside my own mind, like something important had just been removed without permission. The man at the elevator didn't look at me directly, but something about the way he carried himself told me he was not just an employee, not just a partner, but someone who had already been given space in her world that I no longer occupied. Mike's voice came back into focus as he said, almost casually, "He just left 5 minutes ago, sir." 5 minutes. That detail shouldn't have mattered, but it did, because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding from months ago. It was happening in real time. In the same breath, I was standing there trying to prove I still existed in a system that had already updated itself without me. I remember placing my hand lightly on the edge of the security desk, not to steady myself, but to confirm I was still physically present in a situation that suddenly felt unreal. And that was when I noticed something else, something small, something almost invisible. The sign near the entrance that listed executive access protocols had a new line added in recent print, a designation I had never seen before, and it didn't include my name anywhere in its structure. I didn't speak, I didn't argue. I just kept looking through the glass as Victoria and the man turned slightly toward the corridor leading deeper into the building, and for the first time I wondered not just who he was, but when exactly I had already been removed from the story I thought I was still part of. The glass doors of Hale Dynamics were still in my mind when I finally stepped away from the security desk, not because I had resolved anything, but because I had nowhere else to stand that made sense. Chicago traffic moved outside in slow, indifferent waves along West Wacker Drive, horns echoing faintly through the glass canyon of downtown. But inside my head there was only that sentence repeating itself, the one the guard had said, as if it were a routine update in a system I was no longer part of. Her husband already checked in today. I walked without direction for a few seconds, past polished marble floors and corporate branding that felt suddenly meaningless, until I found a quiet corner near the entrance where the air seemed less controlled. That was when memory started to rise, not as a flood, but as small fractures, moments I had once ignored because they did not seem large enough to question a marriage. I remember Victoria in our kitchen in Evanston 3 years ago, standing by the counter with her tablet in one hand, speaking faster than she used to, her mind already somewhere else. "I cannot slow down right now, Jonathan," she had said, not angry, not soft either, just final in a way I did not yet recognize. "This acquisition will define everything." I had asked her then, "And what defines us?" She did not answer immediately. She only looked at me, like the question itself belonged to a different version of her life. That silence came back to me now as I stood on the edge of downtown Chicago, realizing how often silence had replaced conversation between us without either of us formally acknowledging it. There was another memory, earlier than that, when Hale Dynamics was still expanding into its second office in the West Loop. I had visited her after a long assignment review meeting, expecting to celebrate a milestone, but instead I stood outside her glass conference room watching her speak to investors like I was observing someone I barely knew. Afterward, I had said, "You did not even look at me during the entire meeting." She had smiled politely, tired more than apologetic, and said, "I cannot afford distractions when I am in that room." I had mistaken that sentence for discipline at the time. Now it sounded more like separation being negotiated in real time. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and for a moment I hesitated before answering, because I already knew who it would be. "Victoria." I stepped closer to the building facade, the glass reflecting my own face back at me like a delayed version of myself. I answered. "Jonathan." Her voice came through, controlled, careful, as if she had already measured the distance between us before speaking. "You should not be there." I looked up at the upper floors of the building where blinds shifted slightly as people moved inside offices I had once assumed were part of my extended life. "I am already here," I said. There was a pause, not long, but heavy enough to feel like calculation. "I did not expect you to come without warning," she replied. "That is not how we do things anymore." I almost asked her when exactly we had changed meaning, but I already felt I knew the answer would not matter. Instead, I said, "I was told your husband is here." Another pause, shorter this time, sharper. "Jonathan, do not start imagining things." Her tone carried something I had heard before in boardrooms and crisis briefings, the sound of someone trying to stabilize a narrative before it collapsed. "I am in meetings all day," she continued. "Whatever this is, it is not the place." Not the place. I repeated those words silently after she ended the call, looking around the lobby where everything was designed to communicate control, efficiency, belonging. I did not belong in any of it. As I turned slightly, I noticed Mike, the security guard, watching me from a different angle now, his posture less casual than before, as if he had received a silent instruction or second thought from someone above him. He touched his earpiece briefly, then looked away. I followed his gaze toward the reception desk, where a woman in a tailored gray suit was speaking quietly into a phone, glancing at me only once before turning her body slightly so I could not hear. Corporate environments have a way of changing temperature without warning, and I felt it then, not through words, but through behavior. The subtle shift of attention away from me, as if I had become a variable no longer needed in the equation. A memory surfaced again, sharper this time. Victoria at dinner 6 months ago, her fork resting untouched on her plate while she said, "Some decisions are not personal, Jonathan, they are structural." I had laughed gently then, thinking she meant business strategy. I asked her, "Since when did we become structure?" She did not smile. "Since everything started depending on stability," she said. I did not understand then that I was being categorized, slowly, quietly, into something that could be adjusted or removed without disrupting the system. I looked back through the glass doors again. The elevator indicator on the executive floor changed, numbers descending, and I felt an unfamiliar tension settle in my chest, not fear exactly, but recognition of something I could not yet name. Mike spoke again without looking at me. "Sir, you may want to wait outside. There is a scheduled executive transition occurring." His words were polite, rehearsed, but the meaning behind them was not. I stepped back slightly, not because I was told to, but because I needed space to think clearly. Executive transition. That phrase did not belong to a marriage. It belonged to systems, to contracts, to structures that replaced people without emotion. And then I saw it again, not as a reflection this time, but directly through the glass doors. Victoria was standing near the elevator with the same man from before, closer now than memory allowed me to be comfortable with, and she was speaking to him in a way that did not require explanation or translation. The kind of familiarity that does not ask permission. The kind that becomes normal only after something else has been erased. I did not move. I did not speak. I only watched as the realization formed slowly, not as shock anymore, but as something heavier, something built over time that I had refused to measure until this exact moment. And somewhere behind that realization, a quieter thought emerged. One I did not yet want to fully understand, that what I was seeing was not an accident of timing, but the continuation of something that had already been decided long before I ever walked into that building. The city outside the glass walls of Hale Dynamics continued moving as if nothing inside that building had changed the shape of my reality. Taxis flowing through West Wacker Drive, office workers crossing intersections with coffee cups in hand, the ordinary rhythm of Chicago continuing without permission to pause for what I was feeling. But inside me, something had already shifted beyond recognition. I stood near the lobby entrance, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just existing in a space where every second felt slightly misaligned with logic. Victoria's voice was still in my mind, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say. There was no explanation, no hesitation, only control. And control is never neutral when you start to notice it. I turned slightly when I heard footsteps approaching from behind the reception area, and that was when I saw her again, not on the upper floor now, but descending into the lobby space with the same man beside her. Richard Collins. I had not known his name yet at that moment, but I knew the shape of his presence in her life was not temporary. Victoria stopped when she saw me, just for a fraction of a second, her expression tightening in a way that felt like a door being locked from the inside. "Jonathan," she said calmly, as if my presence here required moderation rather than explanation. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You told me not to come." She exhaled slowly, like I was complicating something already scheduled. "This is not a good time," she said. The man beside her did not speak immediately. He only observed me the way people observe interruptions in systems they believe are stable. Then he extended his hand slightly, not aggressively, but with the ease of someone who already understood his position in the room. "Richard Collins," he said. I did not take his hand right away. Instead, I asked, "How long has this been happening?" Victoria's eyes shifted briefly, not away from me, but away from the question. "Jonathan, please do not do this here," she replied. That sentence, more than anything else, carried the weight of years. Not anger, not denial, just exhaustion mixed with control. I finally looked at Richard directly. "I think you should tell me why I was told your husband already left this building 5 minutes before I arrived." For the first time, something subtle changed in his expression, not surprise, but calculation, like a file being reopened that had already been categorized. "There is no misunderstanding," Richard said evenly. You are not part of the current structure of Victoria's personal arrangements. The words were carefully chosen, almost corporate in tone, and that is what made them more damaging than anything emotional. Personal arrangements. I repeated those words silently, because they did not belong to marriage. They belonged to systems that reorganize people without asking permission. Victoria stepped slightly closer to him, and in that movement, I saw something I had ignored for too long. Not affection exactly, but alignment. Two people moving in the same direction without needing to explain why. We separated our personal and professional lives a long time ago, she said. I nodded slowly, because I had heard that sentence before, just never with this meaning attached to it. Separated. I repeated. Or replaced. The air between us tightened. A receptionist behind the desk stopped typing. Even Mike, the security guard, shifted his weight like he was no longer sure what category I belonged to. Richard spoke again, quieter now. You should understand something. Hale Dynamics is entering a restructuring phase. Certain affiliations are no longer relevant to executive operations. I looked at him for a moment, then back at Victoria. Is that what I am now? I asked. No longer relevant? Victoria's expression softened slightly, but not into empathy, more like restraint. Jonathan, you are making this more emotional than it needs to be. That sentence landed differently than anything before it, because it did not deny what was happening. It only reframed it as something I was incorrectly processing. I remember feeling something in my chest tighten, not anger yet, but recognition that I was being narrated out of my own life. I came here because I thought something was wrong, I said quietly. And now I am beginning to understand that nothing is wrong to you at all. Richard glanced toward the elevator, then back at me. This conversation is not productive, he said. Security can escort you out if necessary. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because of how easily a human presence can be reduced to procedure inside these environments. Victoria finally spoke again, and this time her voice lowered slightly. You do not need to make this harder than it already is, she said. Harder for who? I asked. She did not answer immediately, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not require my participation. I noticed then a small detail I had missed before. Richard was wearing an access badge that carried executive clearance markings I had never seen in previous visits, and Victoria did not correct it, did not question it, did not even acknowledge it as unusual. That was when it began to form fully in my mind, not suspicion anymore, but structure. I was not witnessing confusion. I was witnessing replacement that had already been processed through systems I was never shown. Mike stepped forward slightly, careful now, almost apologetic. Sir, I need to ask you to remain in the designated visitor area. I looked at him, then at the glass doors behind him, then back at Victoria. Did you know I was coming? I asked. She hesitated just long enough for the answer to exist without being spoken. I knew you might, she said finally. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than betrayal. I understood timing, because nothing in this building was reacting to me as a surprise. It was reacting to me as an anticipated variable. I took one slow breath, steady, controlled, the way I had learned in rooms where decisions mattered more than emotions. And I realized the story I thought I had walked into was not unfolding in front of me. It had already been written before I arrived. The silence inside the lobby of Hale Dynamics had changed shape by the time I stopped speaking. It was no longer confusion or curiosity. It was something closer to alignment, like the room itself had begun organizing around decisions I had not been invited to witness. Victoria stood near Richard Collins now, her posture controlled, measured, as if every movement had already been accounted for in a system that did not include me. Mike, the security guard, remained slightly forward of the desk, but even his confidence had shifted into something procedural rather than personal. I could feel it in the way he avoided direct eye contact now, as if I had moved from being a visitor to being a classification problem. I remember thinking that was the moment everything should have ended, that I should have turned and walked out into the Chicago air and let the city absorb whatever remained of that conversation. But then the elevator behind us chimed softly, and everything changed again. Not because of noise, but because of recognition. The doors opened slowly on the executive floor, and a man stepped into view from inside the building, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady in a way that suggested authority was not something he had recently acquired but something he had always carried. He was older, maybe late 50s, dressed in a dark suit without any visible branding or corporate hesitation, and for a brief moment no one spoke. Victoria turned slightly when she saw him, and something in her expression softened in a way I had not seen directed at me in a long time, not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. "Director Hale," Richard said immediately, adjusting his stance slightly as if recalibrating his presence in the room. That name hit differently than I expected. Not because I recognized it immediately, but because of the reaction it caused in others. Mike straightened almost instinctively. The receptionist stopped typing entirely. Even the ambient sound of the lobby seemed to reduce itself. The man stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning the room once, and then stopping when they reached me. There was no surprise in his expression, only something closer to memory. "Jonathan Carter," he said calmly, like he was confirming a file that had already been opened before. I did not respond immediately. I simply studied him, trying to place him in a timeline that no longer felt reliable. "Do I know you?" I asked. He nodded slightly, not smiling. "We served together," he said. "You do not remember me in this setting." That sentence carried weight I could not immediately unpack. Victoria looked between us, her expression tightening just slightly. "Director Hale," she said carefully, "this is not an official visit." He raised his hand slightly, not dismissive, but quieting the space without effort. "It has already become one," he replied. Then he looked back at me again, and this time his voice softened just a fraction. "Special Operations Command Briefing Corridor, Norfolk, 2008. You were the one who stayed after the debrief when everyone else left." Something in my memory shifted at that, not fully forming, but enough to create pressure behind my thoughts. I remembered corridors, fluorescent lighting, classified briefings that ended with silence instead of discussion. I remembered staying behind more than once, not because I was asked to, but because I could not leave when something felt unresolved. "That does not narrow it down," I said quietly. For the first time, he allowed a faint expression of recognition to appear. "It was never supposed to be memorable," he said. Then he stepped slightly closer, just enough that the conversation became private even in a public space. "I am surprised you are standing here in a civilian lobby," he continued, "given what your clearance once allowed you access to." That word, clearance, shifted the air again. Victoria's head turned slightly toward me, and I saw something I could not fully interpret in her expression now. Not ignorance, but reconsideration. Richard, however, reacted differently. "Director Hale," he interrupted, "this situation is unrelated to corporate operations." The man did not look at him immediately. When he finally did, it was with calm certainty. "Everything involving him becomes relevant," he said simply. There was no aggression in his tone, but there was finality. Mike took a step back, almost imperceptibly, as if recalculating instructions he had not yet received. I felt something inside me tighten, not fear, but awareness that the rules of this space were no longer consistent. "Jonathan," Victoria said again, but her voice had changed now, less controlled, more uncertain. "Why did you not tell me you knew Director Hale?" I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I did not think it mattered anymore," I said. The man beside the elevator looked at Victoria now, not harshly, but directly. "It matters more than you realize," he said. Then he turned slightly toward Richard. "Do you understand what this building represents structurally?" Richard hesitated. "It is a private executive corporation," he replied. "Partially," the man corrected, "but not exclusively." The words hung there without explanation, which somehow made them heavier. Victoria stepped forward slightly. "What are you implying?" she asked. The man finally looked at her fully. "I am implying," he said carefully, "that the man you are currently treating as an unauthorized visitor once operated in systems that your current corporate structure depends on but does not fully understand." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, but functional silence. The kind that happens when too many internal assumptions stop working at once. I felt every gaze in the lobby shift slightly, not toward conflict, but toward uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider earlier. I was not being evaluated by the people in this room. I was being reclassified by someone who already had access to information they had not yet shared. And that realization changed the weight of everything I had felt since stepping into the building. Because now, for the first time, I was no longer just a husband standing outside a marriage I did not recognize. I was something else entirely. and the room had just begun to understand it before I did. The moment Director Hale finished speaking, something in the lobby of Hale Dynamics shifted in a way that was no longer just emotional, but structural, as if the air itself had begun reorganizing around information I had not yet been given permission to understand. Victoria stood still, her eyes fixed on me now with a kind of uncertainty I had not seen from her before. Not fear, but recalibration, like she was trying to place me into a category that no longer fit the version of me she had been operating with. Richard Collins, however, had gone completely quiet, and that silence from him was more revealing than anything he had said so far. Mike, the security guard, was no longer looking at me as a problem to be managed, but as something that required escalation he had not been trained for. Director Hale stepped forward another half step, his presence not loud, but absolute in the way certain people carry authority without needing to demonstrate it. "Jonathan Carter," he said again, slower this time. "You were never just an employee in the systems you operated within. You were an embedded liaison under joint oversight authorization." I did not respond immediately, because the sentence did not belong to my current life, and yet it landed with the familiarity of something I had once known too well. Victoria turned toward him quickly. "That is not possible," she said. "He works in logistics consulting now." Director Hale shook his head slightly. "That is what the public layer shows," he replied. "Not what the clearance history shows." I felt a quiet pressure build behind my thoughts, not confusion anymore, but fragments of memory trying to assemble themselves into something coherent. I remembered documents I had signed without reading them in full, locations I had entered where no signage existed, conversations that ended with phrases like need-to-know basis and compartmentalized oversight. I had treated all of it as background noise in a life that I thought had already transitioned into civilian simplicity. But now that simplicity felt artificial, like a cover story that had aged without me noticing. Richard finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. "Even if that were true," he said carefully, "this has no relevance to corporate ownership or executive structure." Director Hale looked at him for a long moment, then answered in a way that did not raise his voice, but lowered the temperature of the entire room. "It has direct relevance," he said, "because Hale Dynamics is currently operating under a hybrid compliance framework that includes legacy federal security contracts, and certain personnel classifications still apply to review authority." The word review authority echoed longer than the rest. I noticed Victoria's posture change slightly again, not defensive now, but unsettled. "Jonathan," she said softly, and for the first time she did not sound like she was addressing a variable in a system. She sounded like she was addressing a person she no longer fully understood. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" I looked at her, and for a moment I did not answer, because the truth was not dramatic. It was simply absent from the version of life I had chosen to live with her. "Because I stopped thinking it mattered," I said quietly. Director Hale observed both of us now, his expression measured, as if confirming something internally. "That is often the case with transitions out of classified structures," he said. "People do not realize what continues to follow them." Mike stepped slightly closer to the desk again, speaking cautiously into his earpiece before lowering it. "Sir," he said to Director Hale, "security wants confirmation. This visitor is not on any current access list." Director Hale did not look at him immediately. Instead, he kept his attention on me. "He is not required to be on a current list," he said simply. That statement changed the room in a way I cannot fully describe. Not loudly, not visibly, but internally, like a rule had just been revealed that everyone had unknowingly been operating under. Victoria's voice broke the silence again, but this time it carried something closer to disbelief. "Are you saying he still has authority?" she asked. Director Hale hesitated for the first time, just slightly, before answering. "I am saying," he replied carefully, "that certain authorizations do not expire cleanly when individuals transition between federal and private sector operational structures." I felt my own breathing slow, not because I was calm, but because the situation was becoming clearer in layers I had not expected. Richard took a step back now, just enough to reposition himself away from the immediate center of attention. That movement did not go unnoticed. Victoria saw it, and so did I. And in that small shift, something important revealed itself without being spoken. Alignment was changing. Director Hale turned slightly toward me again. "Jonathan," he said, "when was the last time you accessed your full clearance archive?" I shook my head slowly. "Years," I said. I assumed it was closed. He nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he had suspected. It was never closed, he said. It was dormant. The word dormant felt heavier than it should have. I looked back through the glass doors of the lobby, and suddenly the building did not feel like a corporate headquarters anymore. It felt like a structure built on layers I had never been fully removed from. Victoria took a slow breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Jonathan, whatever this is, I need you to understand something," she said. I looked at her. She continued, "My decisions were not meant to erase you. They were meant to stabilize things I could not explain at the time." There it was again. Not denial, not apology. Explanation without admission. Director Hale stepped slightly aside now, allowing the conversation to exist between us, but still present enough to confirm its weight. I looked at Victoria for a long time before answering. "Then you should have told me I was still part of something," I said quietly, instead of letting me believe I had been removed from everything. Her expression tightened slightly, but she did not interrupt. And in that silence, I realized something fundamental. I was not just standing in a corporate lobby anymore, or in the aftermath of a misunderstanding about identity. I was standing in the middle of two systems that had both been operating around me without ever fully including me in their explanations. And somewhere beneath that realization, a deeper truth began to surface, one that none of them in that room had fully spoken yet. But all of them now seemed to be approaching at the same time, carefully, as if afraid of what would happen once it was finally said out loud. The air inside the Hale Dynamics lobby had changed again, but this time it was not subtle, it was measurable, like pressure dropping before a storm finally breaks. People were no longer watching me as an anomaly. They were watching the room itself, waiting for something to resolve that no one had anticipated would reach this level of visibility. Victoria stood still, her hands no longer composed in front of her the way they had been earlier, her posture now carrying a tension that no executive training could fully hide. Richard Collins had shifted closer to her side, but not in support, in calculation, as if trying to anticipate the direction of consequences rather than comfort. Mike, the security guard, was no longer speaking at all. His hand hovered near his earpiece, but he did not activate it, because whatever he had been instructed to contain was now beyond containment. Director Hale stepped forward again, and this time his voice was quieter, not because he lacked authority, but because authority no longer required volume in a room like this. "We are past procedural clarification," he said calmly. Then he looked at Victoria first. "What you initiated here has now entered compliance escalation." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "I did not initiate anything," she said quickly. "This is a misunderstanding." That was the first fracture, not in the system, but in her composure. Richard immediately responded, his voice sharper now. "This is an internal corporate matter. It does not involve federal oversight." Director Hale turned his head toward him slowly. "That is no longer accurate," he said. Then he looked at me. "Jonathan Carter has active legacy authorization under Tier 3 liaison classification tied to cross-agency operational frameworks. That means his status cannot be ignored by any entity still operating under contract continuity agreements." The words landed like structural exposure, not emotional revelation. I did not react immediately. I simply listened, because for the first time, the situation was no longer about suspicion or personal betrayal. It was about systems intersecting in ways that were not meant to be casually invoked. Victoria took a step forward, her voice rising slightly now. "You are making this sound larger than it is," she said. "This is about my company, my decisions, my marriage." Director Hale did not raise his voice in response. "It is about all three," he said evenly. That silence afterward was not empty. It was recalibration. I felt every layer of the room shift again. But this time it was not confusion. It was realization forming in different directions at once. Mike finally spoke into his earpiece, his voice lower now. "We need confirmation from legal," he said. A pause followed, then a faint response I could not hear clearly. But whatever it was made him straighten immediately. Richard turned slightly toward Victoria. "We should step back from this," he said quietly. That sentence was the first sign of fracture in his confidence. Victoria did not look at him right away. She was still looking at me. "Jonathan," she said again, but this time her voice was different, less controlled, more exposed. I did not think this would reach this level. I looked at her, and I could feel something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not confusion, but clarity. You keep saying that, I replied calmly. But every time you say it, it sounds like you assumed I would never be seen in the parts of your life where decisions actually mattered. That was when Richard interrupted, not because he had authority, but because silence was becoming dangerous for him. This is being misinterpreted, he said quickly. There is no removal, no exclusion, only restructuring of roles within the company. I turned my head slightly toward him. Then explain why I was told I am not in your system, I said. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, he did not have a prepared answer. Victoria stepped in immediately. Because you are not part of executive operations, she said. That does not mean you are erased. I nodded slowly. But I was told I am not recognized as your husband inside this building, I said. That is not semantics. Her expression tightened again. That was a security classification decision, she said. Not personal. Director Hale exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted into something closer to finality. It is personal when identity intersects with authorization records, he said. Then, he turned slightly toward Richard. And your current authorization is under review pending clarification of external influence declarations. That sentence hit Richard differently than anything before it. I saw it in his posture first, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his confidence stopped being visible. External influence? He repeated. What does that even mean? Director Hale did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me again. It means, he said carefully, that certain relationships within executive structures are now being audited for undisclosed overlap with legacy clearance personnel. The word audited created a visible reaction in Richard. Not emotional, but operational. He looked at Victoria quickly now. Did you disclose everything? He asked. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Of course I did, she said immediately. But her voice carried something new now, uncertainty under pressure. I watched both of them in silence, and I realized something I had not fully understood before. This was no longer just about my marriage. It was about exposure, about systems beginning to recognize inconsistencies that had been hidden under assumption. Mike finally lowered his hand from his earpiece. Legal is requesting all parties remain in place, he said, his voice no longer neutral. Corporate compliance has escalated this to executive review protocol. Victoria turned toward him sharply. Executive review for what? She asked. No one answered immediately. That silence was different from the earlier ones. It was procedural silence, the kind that exists right before authority shifts hands. Director Hale finally spoke again, his voice steady but definitive. For verification of rightful operational alignment, he said. Then he looked directly at me. And clarification of your continued classification within legacy oversight frameworks. I felt the weight of those words not as fear, but as inevitability. Because for the first time since entering this building, I was no longer being treated as an unknown variable. I was being treated as something that had always been known, but never fully activated. And as I stood there, watching Victoria, Richard, and everyone else begin to realize that the structure they believed was stable had just encountered something it could not immediately categorize, I understood the simplest truth of all. Nothing in this room was reacting to my presence anymore. It was reacting to what I had always been without anyone here ever asking the right questions. The atmosphere inside Hale Dynamics had become something no longer fully controlled by any single person in the room, not Victoria, not Richard Collins, and not even Director Hale, because once the executive review protocol was mentioned, the structure of authority itself stopped behaving like a straight line and began behaving like a collapsing network. I stood slightly apart from them now, not as a participant in their argument, but as the center point around which their uncertainty was rotating. No one was speaking to me directly anymore, yet everything being said was still about me. That is a strange kind of visibility, when you are no longer addressed, but you are still the reason the room cannot stabilize. Richard was the first to break that fragile balance. This is not what was agreed, he said sharply, turning toward Victoria. His voice no longer carried confidence, only urgency that had started to fracture. You told me there would be no federal legacy interference. Victoria's expression tightened immediately. I did not promise that, she replied. I said I handled internal exposure. Richard took a step closer, lowering his voice but increasing pressure. You said he was retired from all operational frameworks. That word, retired, hung in the air for a moment before Director Hale interrupted without raising his voice. He was not retired. he said calmly. He was transitioned under conditional status. Richard turned sharply now, frustration breaking through his controlled tone. Conditional status does not trigger executive review escalation, he said. Not unless someone activated it. That sentence changed something. Victoria's eyes moved toward me immediately. Jonathan, she said quickly, what did you do? I looked at her for a long moment. Not because I was avoiding the answer, but because I was realizing she genuinely believed I had initiated something in that room. I did not do anything, I said quietly. I walked into a building. That was the truth, and it seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation would have. Mike, the security guard, finally spoke again, but his voice now carried hesitation. Legal is escalating internal responsibility mapping, he said. They are requesting verification of all associated executive relationships. Richard laughed once, but it was sharp, not amused. This is ridiculous, he said. You are treating a personal misunderstanding like a federal case review. Director Hale finally turned fully toward him. No, he said simply. We are treating a mismatch between declared and registered affiliations. The word mismatch landed differently for each person in the room. Victoria went still. Richard looked at her immediately. What did you not disclose? He asked again, but this time the question was no longer controlled. It carried suspicion. Victoria shook her head slightly. Everything was disclosed, she said. Everything relevant. Relevant to who? Richard shot back. His voice rose slightly now, enough that nearby employees turned their attention fully toward them. You told me this structure was clean, he continued. You told me there were no legacy constraints attached to executive transitions. Victoria's composure finally cracked at the edges. Because I was told it was cleared, she said quickly. By legal. Richard stepped back slightly, as if the word legal itself had become unreliable. Then why is he here? He asked, pointing at me for the first time directly. Not aggressively, but with frustration that had nowhere else to go. Why is one man causing this entire system to go into review? That was the moment the conflict stopped being unified and began splitting into separate directions. Director Hale observed this quietly, then spoke with calm precision. Because he is not the cause, he said. He is the trigger for a discrepancy that already existed. Silence followed again, but this time it was different. This was not uncertainty. This was realization beginning to form in fragments. Victoria turned toward me again, her voice lower now. Jonathan, she said, what exactly are you still connected to? I did not answer immediately, because I was asking myself the same question. For years, I had believed my life had simplified after leaving structured operations behind, after shifting into consulting, after choosing distance from systems that required classification and clearance. But standing here, I was beginning to understand that separation is not always recognized by the systems you leave behind. Richard spoke again, but now his tone had changed completely. He was no longer confronting me. He was confronting Victoria. If he still holds any form of active or dormant classification authority, he said, then your entire restructuring agreement may be invalid under compliance oversight. Victoria stared at him. That is not possible, she said immediately, but her voice lacked certainty now. Director Hale stepped slightly closer, his expression unchanged but his tone final. It is not a matter of possibility, he said. It is a matter of documentation. That word changed everything again. Documentation. Not emotion, not assumption, not interpretation. Richard turned slightly away now, pulling out his phone for the first time. His movements were no longer confident. They were reactive. I need legal confirmation immediately, he said under his breath. Victoria noticed immediately. What are you doing? She asked. He did not look at her when he answered. Protecting myself, he said. That was the first fracture between them. Not disagreement, but self-preservation. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. You said this was stable, she said. You said everything was aligned. Richard finally looked at her now, and his expression had changed completely. I said what I was told, he replied. If information was incomplete, that is not my responsibility. That sentence landed heavily. I watched it happen in real time, the way alliances dissolve when pressure replaces certainty. Director Hale observed all of it without interference, as if confirming that what was unfolding was not unusual, only delayed. Mike spoke again, quieter now. Legal compliance is requesting immediate separation of corporate and external classification exposure pending review, he said. Victoria turned toward him sharply. Separation? She repeated. What does that mean? Mike hesitated. It means access suspension for all parties under review protocol, he said carefully. Richard exhaled sharply. This is insane, he said. This is one man walking into a building. I finally spoke again, quietly. I did not walk into anything, I said. I was already inside something you did not realize existed. That was when everything stopped trying to remain polite. Victoria looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time her voice softened completely. Jonathan, she said, almost carefully now, why does everyone here react to you like you are already part of something I was never informed about? I looked at her, and in that moment I understood something I had not been willing to see earlier. I was not entering this system today. I was being reactivated inside it, and the people standing around me were not reacting to my presence. They were reacting to the consequences of realizing that my absence had never been complete. The silence inside Hale Dynamics had changed again, but this time it was no longer the silence of tension or confrontation. It was the silence that follows collapse, when too many systems attempt to recalibrate at once and no one yet knows what the new structure will be. Victoria stood slightly apart from Richard now, not physically separated, but emotionally misaligned, as if the alignment they once shared had begun to drift under pressure. Richard was no longer looking at me. He was looking at his phone, speaking in short, controlled phrases to someone on the other end. His voice lowered but sharp enough that I could hear fragments like compliance, exposure, and contractual ambiguity. Mike, the security guard, had stopped treating the situation as a security incident and was now simply observing it as something he had not been trained to interpret. Director Hale remained still, his presence steady in the middle of the room, as if none of this was surprising to him, only delayed. Then he looked at me again, and for the first time his expression softened, not into authority, but into recognition that something long buried had finally surfaced. Jonathan? He said quietly, this is no longer a containment situation. I did not answer immediately. I felt something in my chest loosen, not because I was relieved, but because I realized I was no longer being evaluated as a threat or anomaly. I was being processed as history. Victoria finally spoke, but her voice had changed. It was no longer controlled, no longer corporate. It was human in a way I had not heard in a long time. What does that mean? She asked. Director Hale paused before answering, as if choosing language carefully. It means the operational framework that includes his classification history is now fully active in audit protocol, he said. And once that begins, it does not pause for personal interpretation. Richard immediately reacted. This is still a private matter, he said quickly. We are dealing with internal executive restructuring, not federal review. Director Hale turned toward him slowly. That distinction is no longer valid, he replied. The words were simple, but they changed everything again. I watched Richard for the first time lose the rhythm of control he had maintained since I arrived. He stepped slightly back, then forward again, as if trying to find a version of the situation that still allowed him stability. If this escalates, he said, his voice tightening, then Victoria's entire restructuring deal is at risk. Victoria turned toward him sharply. My restructuring deal? She repeated. This was about protecting the company. Richard's expression hardened. It was about protecting all of us, he said, but only if disclosures were complete. That word again, disclosures, now carrying weight like accusation rather than procedure. Victoria shook her head slightly. I disclosed everything required, she said. Everything I was told to disclose. There was a pause after that, and in that pause I noticed something subtle but important. The conflict was no longer centered on me. It was now centered on what each of them had told each other and what had been left out. Director Hale stepped forward again, addressing the room as a whole now rather than any single person. At this stage, he said calmly, we are transitioning from identity verification into structural accountability review. Mike shifted uncomfortably. Does that mean we are holding all parties here? He asked. Director Hale nodded slightly. Until clarification is complete. That sentence did not feel like detention. It felt like suspension in time, like the building itself had decided that nothing else could proceed until truth caught up with procedure. Victoria looked at me again, and this time there was something different in her eyes. Not denial, not control, but exhaustion. Jonathan, she said quietly, I did not understand any of this level of complexity when I made my decisions. I studied her for a long moment. "I believe you," I said calmly, and I meant it. That was the first moment in which something between us softened, not into reconciliation, but into understanding that we had both been operating with incomplete maps of the same reality. Richard exhaled sharply. "This is becoming unmanageable," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Then he turned slightly away and spoke into his phone again, but this time his tone was different. Less confident, more uncertain. "I need clarification on exposure thresholds," he said. "Now." Director Hale observed him without interruption. Then he looked at me again. "There is something you should know," he said quietly. I waited. He continued, "Your classification status was never removed because it was never formally closed by originating authority. It was transferred into dormant oversight pending confirmation of post-operational reintegration." The words were technical, but their meaning was simple. I had never fully exited the system I thought I had left behind. I had only stopped being actively visible within it. Victoria's voice broke through softly. "Why would something like that still exist?" she asked. Director Hale looked at her. "Because some roles are not defined by employment," he said. "They are defined by continuity of access during transition periods." I felt something shift again inside me, not confusion now, but perspective. My life after service, my consulting work, even the distance I had created from structures like this, had not been a clean break. It had been a layered separation, one that still left threads intact. Richard suddenly ended his phone call and looked at Victoria directly. "We need to pause everything," he said firmly. "If compliance review continues, your entire executive transition plan collapses." Victoria stared at him for a moment, then replied quietly, "You told me this was already secure." Richard's silence was immediate, and in that silence, something irreversible became visible. Not betrayal exactly, but misalignment of assurances. Director Hale spoke again, but this time his voice carried a tone that suggested closure was approaching. "At this point," he said, "the system is no longer responding to assurances. It is responding to verification." Mike looked at me again, then quickly looked away. Even he now seemed uncertain where authority truly resided in the room. Victoria took a slow breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before. "Jonathan," she said, "what happens now?" I looked at her, then at Richard, then at Director Hale, and finally at the glass walls of the lobby where Chicago continued moving outside as if none of this existed. And for the first time since entering this building, I realized I was no longer standing in a confrontation. I was standing in the moment after confrontation, when systems stop arguing and begin revealing what they were always built to protect. And in that realization, there was no victory waiting. Only clarity, and the beginning of something none of them were ready to name. The silence inside Hale Dynamics did not break immediately after the last words were spoken. It simply changed form, like a room slowly exhaling after holding its breath for too long. No one moved at first. Not Victoria, not Richard Collins, not even Mike at the security desk. It was as if the entire building had entered a state where time itself needed to catch up with what had just been revealed. Director Hale remained still, his attention no longer on confrontation, but on resolution, as if he had seen this kind of transition before in other systems, other structures, other lives. Then he spoke quietly. "The review protocol has reached its confirmation threshold," he said. "We will now proceed with status resolution." Richard immediately reacted. "Resolution of what?" he asked, his voice sharper now, but no longer controlled. "This is a corporate matter, not an operational override." But even as he said it, his confidence had changed. It no longer carried certainty. It carried resistance. Victoria turned slowly toward him, and for the first time, I saw something different in her expression. Not authority, not strategy, but realization. "Richard," she said quietly, "what did you not tell me?" That question did not come from anger. It came from the collapse of trust inside systems that rely on full disclosure to survive. Richard shook his head immediately. "This is not the time for emotional interpretations," he said. "We are dealing with compliance exposure, nothing more." But even he did not believe his own words anymore. Director Hale raised his hand slightly. "Not to interrupt, but to finalize. It is no longer about exposure," he said. "It is about classification correction." The words settled heavily into the room, and something in Victoria finally broke through the controlled structure she had maintained since the beginning of all this. She looked at me, not as a variable, not as a liability, but as something she had misunderstood for a long time. "Jonathan," she said softly, "I did not erase you." I did not answer immediately, because for the first time, I understood she believed that. "I know," I said quietly. And it was true. She had not erased me. She had simply stopped seeing the full version of what I was within the system she was building. Richard stepped back slightly, looking between us now as if the ground beneath his assumptions had started to give way. "This is not what I agreed to," he said again. But the sentence now sounded empty, repeated more out of habit than conviction. Director Hale turned toward him. "Your agreement was contingent on full disclosure compliance," he said. "That condition has now failed verification." That was the moment everything shifted beyond argument. Richard looked at Victoria again, and this time there was no authority in his voice. "Only urgency. You told me this was clean," he said. "You told me there were no external classification risks." Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, she spoke differently. "I told you what I was told," she said. I believed it was complete. That sentence was the end of alignment between them. Not betrayal, not conflict, but separation of understanding. Mike finally stepped forward, speaking carefully now. "All executive access privileges are temporarily suspended pending final classification verification," he said. There was no drama in his voice anymore. Only procedure. Richard exhaled slowly, looking at his phone again, then lowering it without making another call. It was the first time he had no solution to reach for. Victoria turned back to me. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked at her, and for the first time since walking into this building, I did not feel like I was inside a system trying to define me. I felt like I was outside it, observing it collapse into honesty. "Now," I said quietly, "you stop assuming I was ever removed from something I never agreed to leave." She nodded slightly, and something in her posture softened, not into defeat, but into understanding. Director Hale stepped back, his role no longer intervention, but confirmation. "Classification review will continue externally," he said. "This is no longer an active conflict environment." The room did not celebrate that statement. It simply released it. Richard turned slightly away, no longer addressing anyone directly. Victoria remained still for a moment longer, then slowly stepped back from the center of the space, as if distance itself was the only way to process what had changed. I stood there quietly, feeling no victory, no loss, only the strange clarity that comes when a false structure finally stops pretending to be stable. Outside the glass walls, Chicago continued moving, unchanged, indifferent, alive in ways that did not depend on our understanding of what had just shifted inside that building. And I realized something simple, something that did not require explanation or authority. What had broken in this room was not a marriage alone, not a corporate structure alone, but the illusion that people can be fully defined by the versions of them that others choose to recognize. There was no final confrontation after that, no final argument, only distance, returning naturally where distortion had once been. In the days that followed, I did not receive calls demanding answers or explanations. Instead, there was silence, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that restores proportion. Victoria rebuilt what she needed to rebuild, not as punishment or escape, but as correction. Richard disappeared from the structure quietly, as people often do when systems no longer require their role to be maintained. Director Hale returned to his position without further commentary, as if his part had always been to confirm rather than interfere. And I found myself no longer standing at the center of conflict, but at the edge of something far quieter. Not resolution through force, not justice through reversal, but understanding through exposure. I walked out of Hale Dynamics that evening without looking back at the glass doors. The air outside felt colder than I remembered, but it also felt honest. I stopped near the river for a moment, watching the water move beneath the bridges, steady and indifferent, and I thought about how many things in life only become clear when they are no longer being protected by confusion. I did not feel like someone who had won anything. I felt like someone who had finally stopped being measured by systems that never fully understood me in the first place. And in that quiet realization, there was something closer to peace than any victory could ever offer. Sometimes the truth does not arrive as a moment of triumph. Sometimes it arrives as the end of needing to be understood by the wrong people.